Welcome to Leaders of Africa Hangout. It is great to be with you on this show today. My name is Jalili Adebiyi. I'm the host for today's Hangout. The Leaders of Africa Hangout is a live show and experience featuring presentations and discussions that are informative, interactive, and informal. We invite you to discuss and interact with us. Please do hit the subscribe button on YouTube and click the bell to receive notification for all of Leaders of Africa's new content. Some of you have just joined us in the last minute. If you are interested in learning more about Leaders of Africa, I invite you to visit our website, leadersofafrica.org. You can also engage with us on various platforms, on Discord, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Getting back to today's conversation, which is entitled The Barriers to the Implementation of Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The successful implementation of the trade agreement in a timely manner is dependent on many factors, such as infrastructure, the movement of people, intellectual property, as well as bringing banking and finance and the gender inequality gap. It is equally important to note that women play a significant role in the development of African economy, and women also form an important part in the effective and successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Also, women are the face of the informal cross-border trade in Africa, and they account for about 70% of informal cross-border traders. However, women are more likely to be excluded from programs and decision-making about trade issues. Today, I'm joined by two distinguished guests to discuss the barrier to implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement from different angles. Nadira Bayat is a gender and trade expert with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Nadira has served in various roles in other United Nations agencies, including at the International Court for Justice and International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and she has served continentally with African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights. In addition, Nadira has also held other senior positions, including in the South African government, including as a counselor multilateral at the Embassy of South Africa in Washington, D.C. Nadira, welcome to our program today. We're also joined by Louis. Oh, it's a pleasure. We are also joined by Louis Yaw Afful, who is the Group Executive Director of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement Policy Network. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement Policy Network Group is an international NGO that is focused on promoting free trade and the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Louis is an international trade practitioner, and Louis serves on several international boards, such as the Global Chamber of Commerce, and he is a member of the Ghana Chambers of SMEs. Louis is also a member of the Technical Working Group of African Continental Free Trade Agreement of the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Ghana. Louis, welcome to our program today.
Thank you, Dr. Jelly.
And I also like to thank every one of you for joining us live in this program today, and join me in welcoming our presenters and panelists for today's event. To get started today, it's our culture at the Leaders of Africa to get to know one another a little bit. Since we are discussing about barriers and breaking barriers, very quickly, Nadira, would you like to tell me one particular barrier that you are facing in your career, and how you went about breaking that barrier?
Thank you so much, Dr. Jalili, and that's a great icebreaker. And since we're talking barriers, there's no better start to talking about our own personal barriers that we've confronted over the course of our career. And I have to say that I have confronted plenty of barriers, and particularly professional ones. I've served in many capacities. Some were more difficult than others. of course, I think, just as a woman, you often, and I've served in some very male-dominated environments, so I think there was the issue of lack of confidence and, those kind of constraints that you hear about, and you don't often realize that it's yourself that's going through the same thing. And I think I have been fortunate, like many, I have been unfortunate, but I have had some great people, so some fantastic women, some fantastic men who have mentored me, who have supported me over the years, and who have contributed to who I am today. And I hope that in overcoming those barriers, as I have overcome those barriers, that I can support other women in doing the same. And I think when we have a seat at the table, we want to see other women having a seat at the table. And if I can open doors and can help women overcome the same obstacles that I was helped to overcome, that would be great. Thank you.
I mean that is great to know, and that is going to be a significant part of our conversation today. And Louis, over to you. What specific significant career barrier have you encountered in the past? And how did you go about addressing that particular barrier?
I think that I will say it's cut across from look at if Aristotle's description of individual, family, and the nation. So the barrier starts as an individual moving into family circles, moving into the nation or the national circles. Mostly, I think that the greatest one is not being able to really reach the target groups that I would have wished at a goal to really impact certain principles and certain experiences that I feel I got it, and that could have really made a lot of impact to the African youth. So in one way or the other, I thank God that the digital age is really helping us through some webinars like this to really make our voice be heard. And we are doing our best to get it more in books so that one day when we are not there, they will have whatever we have in our minds inside the book for them to read. So, I mean, this is one of the greatest challenge that I've ever seen in career, to not being able to get to all the target group that I really want to. But gradually, I think that we are bridging that divide.
Oh, that's interesting to know, particularly your determination to help cultivate the future for African youth. Not just an ordinary future, but a future that makes them competitive and better positioned to make the continent achieve its noble dreams. So since cultivating the future for African youth has been your commitment, and part of that cultivation of the future is a conversation about Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. May I please call on you, Louis, to do your presentation for 10 minutes? And after that, we are going to have a very short conversation, following which Nadira is going to take the floor to do our home presentation as well. Over to you, Louis.
Thank you, Jelly. I think that my focus is to be on the barriers to the African Continental Free Trade, if I'm correct.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm pre-assuming that we have a background understanding of what the Continental Free Trade is all about. So I wouldn't go back to what, but for those who want to understand, for it to be interactive, I think that the Continental Free Trade is a liberalized policy for 55 countries, but 54 who have decided to sign. And their focus is to ensure that 90% of their products are duty-free, or they don't attract tax on import or export, that is tariffs. And so having that idea, they are going to be guided by their rules of origin. I want to emphasize on the barriers. The first barrier that we are encountering in implementing the Continental Free Trade has to do with the rules of origin. The rules of origin, we're expecting that by this time it should have been totally ready. But the difficulty is that the countries themselves are finding it difficult to really give out so that they can really negotiate. And so it is about 81% ready. It is not 100% ready. And that 81%, the critical part which is not yet ready, has to do with the value additions. And it's important that we really get that going. Why? Because Africa will still import raw inputs for manufacturing, which we are not fully there yet. And so that will have to also be added to some of the raw materials. I'm talking in terms of literal street man. We have to be added to some of the raw materials that is going to be produced from home. When you finish and you want to price, because the whole idea is to make your prices cheap. So the Continental video is looking at 60% or 61% for value addition. Now, if we have still not at this time finished negotiating on value additions, then it's going to be difficult, because then we are going to still have to grapple with the raw material system and leave out, say we want to industrialize through continental free trade. When are we going to have that full 100% rules of origin ready for implementation? That is one of the barriers. Secondly, one of the challenges that African continental free trade is facing is the custom management. If you look at the agreement did not say we have one custom union. That will be one of the agenda 2063 of the African Union. After one market, we are going to one custom union, one currency, one passport, and it continues like that. So now that we are not having one custom union, we are supposed to have custom cooperation and management. They have to cooperate among themselves. And the difficulty now is that the capacity building for most of the managers of this Continental Free Trade custom it's not too high. It's on the low, because most of the custom entry points, most of them even do not understand how to identify what after products and what after products are not. Some of them even have not even cited the after certificate of origin for him to grant access to departure or goods to leave. These are very critical ones. Then again, some custom managements have not yet adjusted their single windows to really accommodate what we are saying, the 90% goods that are going to attract tariff progressive or zero tariff progression. This is very important because the whole emphasis is about export. And so if we are not tackling some of the spirit or the nucleus of the whole activity, then it's going to be a challenge. Because currently in Ghana, I know of only two companies that have shipped under the free trade when they started trading in January 1, 2. And that is not encouraging. So even Ghana is at the forefront of pushes. I don't know about other countries. They're putting data on that. Even when the goods were shipped, now the country of destination had to keep it for a very long time, detain it for a very long time before releasing the goods. Why? Is it that they don't understand, or is it that they have not been part of the process? So custom management and cooperation is really something that is really needs to receive a lot of. And then another area that is very, very important for us to really look at, which I know Nadira will look at it, is that we have a lot of protocols, but we don't have standalone protocol for women. You know, they form about 80% of trade and 80% of informal trade, cross-border trade. And so, though they have been factored in the preamble of the agreement that, they are part of it, they need to have a standalone agreement, a standalone protocol, so that they can be able to practically initiate some of the things that are supposed to be implemented. So I look at that one too as challenging. And I'm glad that the Secretary General has mentioned that come the end of this year, there will be a conference on women. There will be a conference on women. Another great challenge is that the trade-in services, which is very, very key. Trade-in services contribute to about 55% of GDP to African economies, yet it has not been developed fully. And even at the time that under continental free trade, we are supposed to accept it more. Out of the 12 areas that are supposed to be negotiated, it is only 5 priority areas that have been accepted, which is not too good. Leaving out one of the critical ones, health services. Look, when the pandemic hit Africa, where are we getting our vaccines from? And so we need to be able to accommodate all the 12 that have been proposed, been negotiated. Currently, we have only communication service, tourism, construction, and then you have the professional services, and then the financial services. And we are leaving out education. We have not yet fully accepted education, and then health services and others. So it is a barrier because, truth be told, goods can move physically, but when it comes to services, some services might not necessarily need to be mobile. It can be at the country of supply for the other country to receive. Take a critical example like DSTV. DSTV doesn't have to move physically, but somebody can be in Nigeria, can be in Ethiopia, and enjoy the communication service of DSTV. So these are some of the first points I would like to raise that have been a bit. And then finally, I would like to also tackle the issue of real sensitization. Real sensitization. In fact, if you ask me on a percentage scale, I think the sensitization of the continent will be about 40%, if not even less. Why? Because the institutions that are involved in the sensitization process themselves are not ready. Most of them are not ready. In every country, the ministries of trade are supposed to be the agents supervising the decentralization, the sensitization, and awareness of all stakeholders. That accounts for one of the reasons why Nigeria was late in signing to the agreement. Why? Because it went all the way to the top, reached the presidency, and the stakeholders rose up and said, no, we don't understand. We don't understand what you're going to sign, ratify on our behalf. Come back. So the late Ambassador Chinedu, may he rest in peace, he started one more time moving the whole agreement, sensitizing the whole nation, stakeholders, trade unions. And when they were happy and they have accepted it, then it moved through the policymakers' direction to federal parliament, and then finally the president ascended. So sensitization is key. And to end it, the media are not only supposed to be organizing programs for the continental free trade. It's sad. It's not that they feel that, they are organizing the program for continental, but they form part of the whole protocols. They have to accept. That is one challenge. The media is part of the communication protocols and the trading services. So they have to own the continental free trade and see how they can leverage. These challenges are there, and until we're able to push far, many people will not really understand the agreement. Jelly, back to you. Your 10 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Louis, for that very deep and engaging presentation on some of the barriers that may constrain the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But before we move on to Nadira, there's one question I'd like to ask. And this focuses on the issue of sensitization. And I was so glad you brought that up because there has been a lot of conversation in different circles about how are we reaching out to majority of the stakeholders that will be driving this agreement. Because an agreement that is going to be successful needs to be driven by people that are involved in trade activities. And when you look at the current level of sensitization, it happens to be occurring among the educated elites. When I mean the educated elite, I mean among folks like you, among networks that we belong to. And when you look at the characterization of trade activities in Africa, a great percentage of this is happening in the informal sector, and they largely involve mothers that possibly have not gone to universities or to Western type educational institutions. Do you think we are reaching out to them, particularly in the aspect of sensitization? And what do we need to do differently to bring them to the conversation, to the awareness creation effort about the free trade agreement, so that we can leverage their voice to drive the conversation?
That's a wonderful question. You see, when we were during the draft process, when I say draft process, I happened to be part of the draft process until it was adopted and became what we now know as the African Continental Free Trade. At one of the draft process consultative meetings, I raised a very great point, like you're raising. I said, the next time we have a continental agreement, if you look at the information traveling, a pyramid structure, please, it should not start from the top. It should start from below. and go up than going to have Parliament ratify even when their constituents don't even understand what happened. And then later on, they are rushed into to accept it. The informal sector, the approach, one, we must really translate the agreement into various languages that people understand. Secondly, we must really integrate the informal sector by ensuring they are into associations. And when they are into associations and groups, CSOs, private sector associations, and really target them with the language they best understand. Again, it is important to have in-person encounters. And I want to applaud Kenya. Kenya has started a pilot project like that, trying to integrate the informal sector through communication to the rural areas. It's very, very important. The farmer somewhere does not know that his raw materials forms part of a value chain. What is a value chain? How does he understand the value chain? So it is important that, one, institutions, being government institutions, being a private sector institutions, must themselves train their members and make sure that they understand it in their languages and decentralize the languages among the communities, because it is a national issue, because it's a regional issue. Then again, the media should not just have desks within their setups that, we have African Continental Free Trade there. No, the media should know that they are also part of the competition process. And therefore, they should take it upon themselves who is doing the education more, who is outcompeting the other in education. It shouldn't be that when Jelly, you and I have a program that we call upon the media to assist us to expansion. No, they should own it up. They should own it up. They have the ability to really do more programs in various languages where they find themselves. And if we're able to tackle some of these approaches, we will do better. Again, we need to have the academia do their best, because the academia, we're going to have a partner program with the University of Ghana to establish what we call the Center of Knowledge of AfCFTA. So that we need the academia right from educating, even I would prefer right from even primary, low primary or high school, so that they will own it themselves to avoid any exit. When we take these approaches and these circles, at least we'll be able to move forward by the end of the year for a lot of people to understand not just the word after, but to identify an after product, that this is an after product. Because Jelly, finally, the product categorization is 90%, but there is an exclusion of 7% and 3%, which is not supposed to be negotiated. How would the individual know that this product, once I see my country have not given the tariff concession that it want to liberalize it. So once it comes into my country, the ordinary person should be able to identify and draw the attention of the institutions that will look, I've seen this product in this country. It's going to fight our primary industry. It is not an after product. Until we get to that point, we need to adopt some of these processes of translating after to the simple language that another person can understand.
Thank you so much, Louis, for speaking to some of the significant barriers that need to be addressed for AfCFTA to be successfully implemented. And we'll be coming back to many of the important points that you raised, casting a wider net that enables us, to get deep and deeper into the conversation about some of these issues and how different stakeholders can be brought to address or alleviate some of those barriers. Nadira, it's your time to do your presentation for 10 minutes. And following that, we are going to devolve into a panel conversation. It's sort of back and forth between you and Louis and the audience that are joining us on this program today. So Nadira, over to you to do your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Jalili, thank you to the audience, to the participants, to Louis for that incredibly informative presentation. I mean, every time I listen to him, I learn so much more. And I think we're really privileged to have him, because indeed he's one of the architects and the pioneers of the AfCFTA.
So the focus of my presentation is going to be on gender-responsive trade policies, and specifically on the support that the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa is providing to African policymakers in the design of these policies. Now, the topic for today's discussion is on barriers, and I'm going to focus on gender inequalities as a barrier to inclusive AfCFTA implementation, and particularly on what we've been doing to sensitize African policymakers and governments on the importance of designing and then implementing gender-responsive policies to address these distinct trade barriers and inequalities as part of an inherent and intrinsic component of AfCFTA implementation. Now, we know that, can we just go to the next slide, please? Now, the outline of my paper is as follows. I'm going to be looking firstly at the opportunities for women in the AfCFTA, but with a distinct focus on women entrepreneurs and women-owned businesses in the formal, informal sector, and women as cross-border traders. But in saying that, we know that women make a significant contribution to trade in African economies and in multiple different roles, as workers, as producers, as entrepreneurs in the formal and informal sector, as taxpayers, as consumers and users of public services. While recognizing these roles and recognizing the fact that women will be impacted in all of these roles, I am going to, for the purposes of my 10-minute presentation, focus on women entrepreneurs and women informal cross-border traders, and specifically on the binding constraints that disproportionately affect women in their various roles, and why we can't forget about this in the context of inclusive AfCFTA implementation. We're then going to look at some of the very key provisions in the agreement to address these gender barriers with an emphasis on non-tariff barriers, look at how we operationalizing the approach to gender mainstreaming. I see that some of the questions in the chat were, who's responsible for this? Is it the private sector? Is it government? And I think it's important to understand at the outset that the AfCFTA agreement is a continental agreement, but implementation is going to take place at the national level. So national strategies to implement this historic Pan-African agreement will have to be designed by African governments. And then we talk about, okay, how do we now integrate the gender dimension into these strategies so that gender inequalities, gender disparities, particularly in the trade environment, are highlighted and addressed in policies and in actions and in other context-specific and targeted interventions, because we know there is no one-size solution for this. Interventions have to be targeted, they have to be specific, and they have to be informed by women. And then very quickly, we're going to look at some gender-responsive policy actions for inclusive AfCFTA implementation. I just see something on my screen saying your internet connection is unstable, so I might switch off my camera intermittently. I think I'm going to switch it off for a bit and then go back online, if that's okay. But you will still be able to hear me.
And that's okay, Nadira.
Okay, great. So we're going to look at the next slide. Now, very quickly, what are the opportunities for women in the AfCFTA? So, of course, there's the single market under the AfCFTA agreement that Louis spoke about that connects 1.3 billion people across 55 African countries with a GDP of 2.5 trillion. That's expected to bring considerable benefits to the continent. Of course, the AfCFTA is going to offer expanded opportunities in all economic sectors, and particularly in agriculture, in manufacturing, in services, as sectors that are expected to gain the most in AfCFTA implementation. The development of women represent about 50% of the labor force in agriculture, and there will be gains in agriculture because the AfCFTA will be stimulating a demand for intra-African food products. And in that way, will provide women entrepreneurs, will provide women producers with expanded access to regional food markets. And in this way, we see how the AfCFTA can support a predominantly woman-led sector Of course, I'm not going to go into the details now, but lots of publications to show you in line of modeling forecasts by ECA about the expected benefits and the forecast of intra-African exports in agriculture that's expected to increase by 20 to 35%, and gains are also expected in exports in meat products, in milk, in dairy products. Smallholder farmers in particular can benefit from the opportunities that Louis was telling about, integrating their activities into regional agricultural value chains and to higher value agricultural commodities. Now, there's also the opportunity in manufacturing, because the AfCFTA is all about driving industrialization. So there will be the opportunity with more labor-intensive manufactured goods. And with that is going to come new opportunities for female employment, not only in the traditional female-dominated sectors such as textiles and wearing apparel, but also in more highly productive sectors that tend to be male-dominated, including electronics and vehicles and transport equipment. And freer intra-African aid is going to contribute to closing the gender wage gaps. And there's been a recent World Bank study that tells us that wages will grow slightly faster for women than for men, because output is going to expand in key female labor-intensive industries. And we can also share the results of that study with you. So the AfCFTA is also going to create implementation and new trading and entrepreneurship and trading opportunities for women in the formal sector and in the informal sector. And this, as you can see, according to the slides, women-owned businesses are going to benefit from increased access to the economies of scale and increased exports of value-added products. We're going to have cheaper raw materials through reduced tariffs. That creates new opportunities for semi-finished goods, where larger export-oriented industries can source suppliers from smaller women-owned businesses across the borders. And there are also opportunities for women entrepreneurs to participate in higher value-added manufactured goods and processed product value chains that Louis had expanded on. And then the production, sourcing, and distribution opportunities, again, for women-led businesses. Now, there's significant benefits also through the AfCFTA for small-scale cross-border traders. And this is through simplified trade regimes. Now, the AfCFTA agreement doesn't say anything about simplified trade regimes. It doesn't say anything about informal cross-border traders, but it does promote trade facilitation as the anchor of the AfCFTA. And trade facilitation and simplified trade regimes as an innovative trade facilitation instrument can serve as a catalyst, particularly for small-scale cross-border trade. So in this way, we can see that there could be significant benefits for informal cross-border traders. And we all know that women constitute the majority, up to 60, 70% of informal cross-border traders in some African countries. Next slide, please. Now, AfCFTA market liberalization offers significant opportunities, but it also holds potential risks. And I'm not going to go into that in great detail. I'm finishing a paper, which I hope to share with you by next week, which will expand on this. But women-led businesses will face major constraints when competing with imported goods when trade is liberalized. Now, we know that the majority of women-owned enterprises on the continent are micro. They're small. They involve small-scale trade. So there are opportunities for growth that will come with an integrated continental market, but there are also risks, particularly for micro entrepreneurs, through exposure, through increased competition. Now, this is not only for entrepreneurs, you're also going to see the same thing in the agricultural sector with small-scale female farmers. So the availability of cheaper imports through AfCFTA implementation can affect the sale of locally produced goods by micro entrepreneurs. And that in turn can erode their income and can shrink their livelihoods. Now, AfCFTA market liberalization, we have to understand, and it's so important for us to make sure and to hold our policymakers to account and bring this to their attention, because it will not have the same impact on women and on men and on groups of women and on groups of men. So it's incredibly important that we remember this and we bring this constantly to the attention of our policymakers, because there are prevailing gender inequalities in resources and opportunities that will allow men and women to earn a livelihood through access to economic assets such as land, access to income and employment, through exercising decision-making powers, the inequalities in capabilities with regard to basic human abilities in terms of health, in terms of education, and of course there's security inequalities in terms of vulnerability to conflict and violence. Now, these three dimensions will have an impact on women's participation in the economy and specifically in trade and export competitiveness. Now, there are also a range of gender-related trade barriers that pose a distinct risk through intra-African trade and through the exports of goods and services, particularly by small businesses and women-led businesses, which form the majority of small businesses. Now, there are non-tariff barriers, and I'm not going to go into to all of them, but women confront a range of non-tariff barriers, and these restrict their access to markets, right? So they limit the ability of women-led SMEs to export. And amongst these are these complex at-the-border issues that include completion of sanitary and phytosanitary certificates, certificates of origin, permits, export certificates, and other trade documentation that expedites the movement of goods across borders. Now, when we look at this, we also have to think of inequalities, again, gender inequalities. Why is this the case? Because we go back to issues of inequalities and disparities in education and skills development and training. So the AfCFTA is not just a trade agreement. It's an instrument for sustainable development. It's a tool for sustainable development. And as a tool for sustainable development, we have to have a holistic approach. We cannot just address the AfCFTA in silos. It cannot just be trade. We have to have we have to interrogate it more deeply. Of course, there are limited access to information on trade issues that pose a problem, tariffs, rules of origin, customs procedures, and these remain a particularly acute NTBs for small-scale businesses. Now, women-owned enterprises are also constrained by gender-specific barriers that are essential for improving the growth and the production competitiveness. And these include legal discrimination, finance, assets, skills gaps, social norms, and again, the risk of gender-based violence. So these, although there are all these phenomenal, thank you, Aisha. I see Aisha's encouraging remarks there from the corner of my eye. So although there are all these great opportunities in the AfCFTA, it's impossible. How are women going to be able to grow? How are they going to be able to compete? How are they going to be able to be competitive in an integrated continental market if their businesses remain small? They also critical financing gaps, and I'll share some publications from ECA that talk about how financing gaps that are so critical for women's entrepreneurship and serve as a strong driver of economic growth and development make it impossible for women's businesses to grow. And actually, the AfTB estimated a $42 billion financing gap for African women across business value chains. So, Louis was talking to us about value chains, but women, again, are going to be disproportionately impacted and are going to be unable to leverage these benefits in value chains because, of course, there are these constraints that exist. Infrastructure constraints, including access to reliable road connectivity, transport, storage, preservation, which has consequent implications for women, and particularly female farmers and their post-harvest losses. So in the context of the AfCFTA, when we're talking about barriers, we cannot not consider these inequalities. And in conversations and in these dialogue platforms that are going to be convened, that have already started to be convened by the Secretariat, by national governments, by the African Union, by private sector, we need to be highlighting what these inequalities are and their implications for inclusive AfCFTA implementation. And it's particularly important that you understand what these are, you interrogate them, and you relay them. What are the gender discriminating policies? What are the prevailing laws? What are the socio-cultural barriers and norms that prevent women from engaging and participating and benefiting from from local trade, from regional, and now intracontinental trade? Next slide, please. So, of course, Jalili, you're going to tell me when my time is up, because I always...
I think you have about 2 more minutes to round up the presentation. It's been a very engaging presentation. It's been a very engaging presentation.
Okay, so I'm going to leave this with you because I've still got a few slides to go, and in 3 minutes it's going to be impossible to reflect.
So we can give you 5 minutes to get done with the presentation.
Okay, but again, of course, informal cross-border traders, again, have gender distinct challenges, and of course, NTB challenges. And interestingly enough, these NTB challenges have been exacerbated. And, I think what we knew anecdotally has now been confirmed by a very interesting study undertaken by in the EAC, by the Eastern African Sub-Regional Support Initiative, that speaks to new and emerging NTBs arising from COVID-19 imposed measures. And some of these were, I think, border closures that restricted the movement of people, restricted crossings, and that for only cargoes, trucks, mandatory testing, a ban on meetings and gatherings. And that also resulted in women having to resort to informal channels, and then more bribery, extortion, confiscation of goods by security agents. So all of these have a ripple effect. And we've seen NTBs and the implications on women being particularly acute during COVID. Next slide, please. Okay, so the AfCFTA agreement. Now, what does it tell us about gender equality? Nothing, not very much. Not nothing, I think, but not very much in comparison to what the regional economic community instrument tells us. There's something in the preamble, there's that contains an explicit reference to the importance of gender equality for the development of international trade and economic cooperation. There's Article 3E that emphasizes the need to promote and attain inclusive socioeconomic development and gender equality as part of the transformation of state parties. And that is important because it is one of the general objectives of the AfCFTA agreement. So, the fact that state parties have recognized the intrinsic link between inclusive socioeconomic development, gender equality, and structural transformation is particularly important, because we cannot be talking about inclusive socioeconomic development as the cornerstone of the AfCFTA, as our as the drivers, as our tool for sustainable development, if we have gender inequalities. And this is something that we just need to keep raising at every opportunity and at every platform that we get. And there's also Article 27D of the Protocol on Trading Services that talks about improving the export capacity of formal and informal service suppliers, with specific reference to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Next slide, please. Now, there are other provisions in the AfCFTA agreement that are not gender specific, but have particular consequence for women, and are particularly relevant for women, and can bring specific benefits if applied in a gender sensitive manner. There's customs cooperation, trade facilitation, and transit annexes. And these are your entry points into the AfCFTA that can really benefit women informal cross-border traders and entrepreneurs, because these provisions will simplify and harmonize customs and border procedures, and trade facilitation measures as the anchor will
promote simplified trade regimes that will support and boost small-scale cross-border trade. Of course, there's technical barriers to trade, phytosanitary measures that will cover harmonization of standards that will make it easier for small-scale traders and smallholder farmers to satisfy regulatory requirements. Now, there's also technical assistance, capacity building, and training provisions. And these are incredibly important. And it's important for you to be able to articulate what your training needs are, what your capacity building needs are, what your technical assistance needs are, because this will help you to access this will give you the kind of training that you require to be able to access higher skilled jobs and upgrade into higher productivities in the AfCFTA, because women have a lower trading capacity to men. And it's really these provisions that we need to be able to leverage to ensure that we build the low trading capacity for women to be able to participate effectively in the AfCFTA. Our historic NTB barrier mechanism that we're going to share the details with you. As we know that women are disproportionately impacted by NTBs. Now, this trade.barriers.africa platform will give you the opportunity to report these NTBs. And we're also going to share a user manual that will give you more information and more detailed explanation of how to use the AfCFTA non-tariff barrier reporting, monitoring, and elimination mechanism. And next slide. Now, I've already spoken to this. I'm not going to go into any detail, but we cannot assume that the gains from the AfCFTA implementation will be equitably distributed. So our countries are developing national strategies, and the idea is to now ensure that we mainstream gender into these strategies. And of course, gender mainstreaming is really making the concerns and experiences of women and men part of the design and the implementation and the evaluation of policies, with the ultimate objective of informing policy interventions and measures and programs that will allow women to be able to leverage new trade and economic opportunities inherent in the AfCFTA. Next slide, please. And we're doing this through gender mainstreaming. And particularly, I'm not going to be able to go through the details, but there are publications, including the one that I'm completing, on the approach to gender mainstreaming in AfCFTA national strategies. But in the main, it requires assessing the gender differentiated differences, the implications of AfCFTA market liberalization. What are the opportunities in priority sectors, in regional value chains for women's economic empowerment? What are the potential risks? What are the gender-specific barriers to trade? And again, we want to, at the end, be able to identify context-specific interventions to inform gender-responsive policies and complementary measures that will allow women who tend to be disproportionately impacted by gender inequalities, by gender-distinct trade barriers, to exploit these new opportunities as part of inclusive AfCFTA implementation. Next slide, please. Very quickly, we do this through, and unfortunately, but I'm glad that we spoke about the consultation process. And he did provide a very comprehensive overview of gender inclusive stakeholder consultations, because that is exactly what this is about. The AfCFTA national strategies are being developed, and we need to be able to be part of these consultations. So it's really understanding where your country is at in developing these national strategies, knowing that gender inclusive consultations are a fundamental component of these national strategies, and ensuring that we sensitize our policymakers to wanting to ensuring that we are part of this. And consultations will be convened at various levels, because there are different entry points. There's the Secretariat, there are international organizations, and of course, and there's civil society like your good selves, and of course there are national government intervention. So we can influence the process, including through today, through the webinar convened by leaders of Africa. This is part of gender inclusive stakeholder consultations, but maybe just not in the context of the design of the national strategy. There's also a component for a monitoring and evaluations part of the strategy. And I saw, Aisha, I think there was a question that you had on monitoring and evaluation. And through the national strategies, we do have the opportunity to influence this and making it a gender-sensitive component that I also explain about in the publication that you will receive next week. There's also the AfCFTA Communication and Visibility Plan that Louis spoke to you about, where the media is involved and where governments take the AfCFTA out of the capitals and across the country to explain what is this agreement about? How do we make it simplified? How do we just the messaging around it? We don't want it to be a high-level technical agreement that is restricted to trade negotiators either. It has to be simplified, and this is only the beginning. But you need to understand that there are processes in place to be able to do this. And today's conversation is but one of them. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to be able to, unfortunately, go into all the details of what this entails. I have broken it down into sub-bullets, but just to understand at a high level that these are the priorities that we're looking at in terms of gender responsive policy actions for inclusive AfCFTA implementation. I have only focused on the interventions for women as entrepreneurs and women as small-scale traders, but it's important for us to understand that the AfCFTA has to go beyond that. We are looking at women in agriculture, and in agriculture at small scale, female farmers. We are looking at women as workers in manufacturing, women as entrepreneurs in manufacturing, women informal cross-border traders. So here I have focused on policy actions for inclusive implementation for women entrepreneurs, but we have to understand that AfCFTA inclusive implementation needs to interrogate the role of women in multiple capacities. So I'll leave that with you, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much for this detailed cross-cutting presentation, Nadira, and that sort of complemented some of the issues that were raised by Louis. And I'd like to bring to your attention that I was actually involved during my undergraduate days at the University of Lagos in cross-border trading activities. And the majority of those that I witnessed during my various trips from Nigeria to Benin Republic, buying and transacting in goods and merchandise, majority of those that were involved in cross-border activities, trading activities, were mostly women. And I can tell you that based on my raw statistics, based on my personal experience, majority of those women, close to 95% of them, were not educated in any Western institution. And you alluded to many significant ways that women may face many significant barriers that may constrain them from fully participating in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So the question is this to you, Nadira. When we talk about women, are you thinking of women in the singular? Or are you thinking of women in the plural? And when I mention women in the plural, I'm looking at women from the perspective of women that are educated and those that are not educated in the Western parlance. And what does the construction of a gender-sensitive AfCFTA agreement mean for this type of women that are not educated? How do we bring them to drive the implementation of AfCFTA? And it's not just about implementation. I also want you to take a look about how we can also drive them into the process of policy formulation about AfCFTA. Because when people are left out of the process of policy formulation, it may be that they may not be able to have a leverage on the successful implementation of what they've not been part of. So how do we get to bridge this gap, making sure that those women that are not educated are not left out of the process of the implementation of AfCFTA and the consequential gains of it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Jalili. And that's a critical, it's such an important question. And I think we're talking women in the plural here, and we're talking because ultimately women in the private sector, I mean, I'm South African, and the educational disparities in my country, and we have incredibly educated women who don't really need the AfCFTA agreement to be explained to them, but you also have those who do. So how do we ensure that this historic Pan-African agreement that we are all so incredibly excited about serves the need and the priorities of all women? Because those women in the formal sector in South Africa and corporate South Africa really don't need the kind of sensitization and advocacy that women in the rural areas of South Africa require on the AfCFTA. But we will be reliant on our policymakers and our governments to a large extent on this, because, as I said, the AfCFTA is an agreement, but it's implemented at the national level. But in saying that, it is an agreement that will be led by African policymakers, but supported by other partners. And of course, the private sector here is incredibly critical. Media is incredibly critical. Civil society is. So what we're doing in these consultative forums that, and I take as an international organization and with ECA, what we're doing in terms of addressing those ensuring that marginalized voices are part of the implementation of the AfCFTA is really advocating for a cross-sectoral voices to be involved in the AfCFTA national implementation committees. Now, these committees, and I'm sure Louis can tell you more about them, are led by ministries of trade. So traditionally, it would only be ministries, for the most part, ministries of trade. I mean, you would have some governments who would include representatives of informal cross-border traders, perhaps, community, other smaller community organizations. But what we are saying is you have to have wide representation in this AfCFTA implementation committee, because it's through this implementation committee that they support the monitoring of the agreement. They ensure that the agreement reaches wider communities, that it's not just restricted to formal sector businesses. So if you get representation from informal cross-border traders, from community-based organizations, from grassroots organizations, you will have a wider representation of voices in AfCFTA implementation. But this will be, so it's the kind of advocacy that we are engaging in with governments. We really are engaging with them to ensure that they have as wide a representation as possible in these committees. And then I want to go to also talk about trade facilitation, because it's incredibly important in the context of addressing the priority needs and concerns that will be highlighted in these committees, because it's part of AfCFTA implementation. When we're talking about monitoring, when we're talking about what are the issues of various stakeholders, they will be responded to in trade facilitation measures. Now, I spoke to you about simplified trade regimes, and that's one of them. So we're talking about, and a lot of these trade facilitation measures have been implemented very successfully at the REX level. So we're talking about, in the context of the AfCFTA, of scaling these up, of building on them, of best practices, of lessons learned. So what would a gender-responsive trade facilitation in the era of the AfCFTA entail? If we're talking about the harmonization of Continental, of a simplified trade regime, right, that builds upon simplified trade regimes in the REX level. If we're talking about what's required for small-scale traders to take advantage of AfCFTA implementation in terms of providing them with simplified customs documents, a common list of goods, assistance in completing customs procedures, the list of goods that should be covered. What are the infrastructure gaps as part of a gender responsive trade facilitation agenda? For example, measures could include improved security lightings, gender-sensitive border infrastructure, such as cross-border storage, health and sanitary facilities. How do we address poor market infrastructure, that I spoke to you about? So it's these kinds of critical issues that will be important. And of course, gender-sensitive customs training for our customs officials and border officials at ports of entry and exit. What does a digital trade facilitation agenda entail? And Louis spoke a little, he spoke about, and I'm sure he will explain in more detail about digital trade solutions, because that's incredibly critical. Now, I was reading the results of the survey in the EAC, and they're talking about even with informal cross-border traders who need to be empowered through e-commerce. And this is what COVID has illustrated. It has highlighted, we thought before e-commerce is just for formal sector businesses, but COVID has told us, no, it's not. The informal sector and informal cross-border traders are also need to be empowered through e-commerce. But again, we need to develop and expand ICT, digital infrastructure. We need to support a woman's participation in e-commerce through bridging the digital gender divide, through addressing digital illiteracy. Digital skills is one of the main drivers of the digital divide. We need to develop cross-border payment system, mobile banking system, and other digital solutions. What is a digital trade facilitation agenda? What would that entail? We need to be able to empower traders to be able to use mobile devices for business purposes, such as making digital payments and applying for digital credit, because a lot of them have mobile devices, but they are not using them for business purposes. So, in a nutshell, these are some of my thoughts on how to empower a wider representation and equal representation of all women in the AfCFTA. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that detailed elucidation on some of the things we need to do in that area. And Louis, one of the issues you alluded to is the need for reforms at the level of immigration. You alluded to the need for hard reforms and soft reforms in the area of capacity building and related stuffs. So the question to you, Louise, is this: how do we bring women in the informal sector to drive the conversation on the reforms that we need at the custom level for us to successfully implement the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? And in doing this, what particular strategies would you suggest for stakeholders that are pushing the African Continental Trade Agreement, Free Trade Agreement, to implement, taking into consideration that the barriers that women face, particularly women in the informal sector, vary from country to country? We can't hear you. You're muted, Louise.
All right, sorry. Thank you for that question, and congrats to Nadira for a wonderful presentation. I think that it's this is a national question. I say it's a national question because though we have women in the informal sector, there's a women in the formal sector when it comes to trading services, especially ICT. They need to also come together. There are women in a lot of associations when it comes to tourism, but they form a lot of percentage. It's a national issue because if policymakers see it as having women inclusiveness in their democratic systems, in their democratic institutions, as even reflects in political circles where in terms of cabinets, in terms of parliamentary, all these are very important. That is even where to start. Very important from in terms of policy. Because if they are not there, how are we going to push for policy in the first place? That is very, very important. We need to look into how many women must be in cabinet per our national constitutions. These are very important. Secondly, because continental agreements are ratified by parliaments. And parliament, which is made up of all men or all males, you can assume what will be next. Then again, another important thing is that a lot of women CSOs are not receiving strong financial support. They have to really grapple from the backside. And so they are not able to really push more. This is the time that I think that they should come together. CSOs focusing or private sector focusing on women should really come together to form confederacies. This is very, very key. For example, if you take AWEP, I'm giving a critical example like AWEP, which one of the programs that was also instituted by the former Hillary Clinton, I think it's a US program, Africa Women, AWEP. You see that there's a kind of consistency, and their number is so wide. There are more than about 5,000 cut across Africa, and they have a voice. So we need to expand the various satellite groups of women found within the national borders of the member states. Secondly, we need to have it as part of our democratic inclusions. Again, we need to also understand that even if you take the AfCFTA Secretariat itself, AfCFTA Secretariat, the architecture and operationalization, like I said the last time, we are hoping that the whole structure will have a 50-50 between women and men at the top. We are hoping to have a woman Secretary General. These are very, very important. Now, if you take, for example, the banking industry, if you look at the corporate section of most of the banking industry, you will not find a lot of women. Majority have been positioned most of the time behind the teller. I mean, this is my personal observation. And so right from the word go, our structure doesn't seem to really want to open up the women inclusiveness. And that will not support the cause of AfCFTA, because the African Continental Free Trade builds upon the national structures. What we must do is that we need to push for this standalone protocol on women. Because from what Nadira have said, what we are saying, they will best know how the structure should be. Talk about payment systems. Women trade a lot. They exchange a lot of currencies. Now, women having smartphones, I tell you, is their bank. They might not even need to go to a bank to transact. We have to do strong payment capacity building for most of women who do a lot of cross-border trade. Well, thank God we have the Pan-African payment system. But if you ask me, has it really been implemented fully? Though it is there, it has started, but how many informal women have been taken through the look? If you want to transact between Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, you don't need to go for a CFA franc. You can denominate it in your homeland currency. They need to understand. And so one important thing is that we need to really look at our targets, look at the institutions that are supposed to bring all these cohesions. And then again, we need to have timelines for whatever we want to say. Because most of the time you go to most countries, look, all that we are saying have been on the books for a very long time. Guess that there's no timeline. And so you can't hold anybody to accountability. This is very, very key. Well, what I was sharing the last time, what our network is doing, that because of that, we decided to push for a strong subsidiary. We call it the Women of Africa Network. And my vision for that network is to push until the Secretariat or the presidents or the heads of states adopt one full protocol for women. Not only that, we are also using that to secure strong financing for SMEs. Strong financing for SMEs, women in SME. Afro-Asian Bank said they are going to support financial institutions within every member state to support women associations in that. But their plan should be broad. They should really have a real architectural plan, not just say we are going to support women in SME. How are you going to do it? You need to identify value chain associations. If you come to Ghana, women form a lot when it comes to tomato trade, for example. Tomato trade is in millions of Ghana cedis. Okay, so if you are supporting, you say, okay, when we come to Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, we have realized that women who are into tomato or this value chain are so many. Let us give them a strong capacity to trade. Let them also trade through a platform, a digital platform called this, so that we can monitor and help them in terms of their transaction. We need to have practicality to these, what do you call it, paperwork. The paperwork are many, but the practicality are some of the things that we're saying. Again, if you look at, for example, the protocol that Nadira talked about in terms of custom management, the trade facilitation. Look, as for trade facilitation, the difficulty is that most of the immigration officers out our ports, our borders, and then those custom officers, what he knows and he has been taught is exactly what he's not open to change, because there is no alternative plan. They see women as a normal kind of trading that has existed before, and therefore it needs a certain robust approach. Let me take Ghana, Burkina Faso border, for example. We have a border town called Aflawo, and about 80% of those who trade there are women. Aflawo and then Togo. 80% of them are there. The way customs and immigration used to treat and do things is the same way. The only change that is going to come is that COVID-19 allowed for the closure of borders. And so if we really want to see a review, then it is not going to be news having a woman heading most of our migration borders, for them to really have for people to have a feel of how they really will take issues to be. So for me, I'm looking at one particular approaches. I've not even tackled other countries yet. One approaches that we have to be able to do in order to be able to allow women to really have the feel of the continental free trade is nothing new, Dr. Jelly. It's nothing new. The only thing is new is that it is going to promote liberalization. What we used to do, we are doing the same. If we don't pay a lot into our infrastructure and have serious computerized systems, the way we are going to trade is the same that we're going to trade. And so the only thing that AfCFTA brings on board is for us to have a kind of paradigm shift. And that shift has to do with spending money in our infrastructure, financing SMEs who are bringing a lot of revenue, making sure that those who are paid to do sensitization are paid to do that. These are the physical approaches that we have to do, and with timelines. Give us ourselves a year. By the end of the year, we're expecting that 70% of women in the informal sector will be roped into the formal sector. You are given a timeline. These are some of the things that we need to do. And my final point is that I'm wishing women advocates to come together, to really come together, have a strong voice. Because when you are together, you can be able to push more. But if not, and you are scattered, it makes it a bit difficult, because where are you going to get the funding? So these are some of the critical areas. And I would like also to stress that when it comes to health services, our women and youth really go through a lot more than the men. And so I'm appealing to our leaders to really fast track the negotiations on health services and fast track it now. If we take critical example of what is happening in other jurisdictions like India, the picture tells it all. Our women are the brunt. Today they are mothers. Tomorrow they have to be at home for maternity leave. The men will continue to go to work. When there's pandemic, it is the mother and the child. So we realize that there are certain agency. There is a call for agency in terms of how to approach women empowerment and after. This is what I would like to conclude with.
Thank you so much for those wonderful talking points about how to bring women, particularly those in the informal sector, to drive the AfCFTA conversation. And it's time to call on some of the participants to ask questions. And I'd like to call on Blessing to unmute herself and ask questions to any of the two panelists. Hello, Blessing.
Hello, hi. It's a pleasure to be here. My question is sparked by what Louis just said about setting timelines for the implementation process. Like, who would be setting the timelines? Would it be specific to each country, or would it be a committee that's there at the AfCFTA? Because what I've seen is that there's a gap between the people who are employed to do the implementation of the agreement and those who are on the ground, who are the traders, the informal traders, the women who are not aware of what the agreement even means. So who will be setting the timeline so that it tailors to the people, the targeted audience?
Over to you, Louise.
That is a very, very good question. And in fact, the timelines and after your Ministry of Trade and Industry is supposed to ensure that you benefit from after. So whatever association you belong to, you must start approaching them. They are supposed to make sure that they keep the time calendar of the Secretariat itself, because we are not just there. We need to be able to know how trading is going. So this year, one timeline that has been set by the Secretariat is that this year, before the end of the year, there will be a full women conference on after. It is after that we'll be able to know, because they have to push for the adoption of anything to the extraordinary summit of the heads of states. So let's hope that this year, when the conference is done, which is, I'm sure that the Secretary General will invite every participating state actor. So for me, the timelines is supposed to be pushed forward by your Ministry of Trade.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry, Jalili, can I also add to that?
Yeah, I like, but as you do, I like you to also speak to this. They've spoken about all these women conference. And
yes, Louis is right. And he is, very connected to the AfCFTA Secretariat and the development of the AfCFTA Women in Trade Protocol and SMEs. But in addition to that, so there is that will be developed and is being led by the Secretariat. And of course, there is the Ministry of Trade that is leading on the implementation of the national strategies. Now, Blessing, when we spoke about the importance of these interventions and the monitoring of these interventions, it will be done through the Ministry of Trade and through this AfCFTA National Implementation Action Plan. All national strategies will be required to have an action plan that will have strategic objectives, that will have the actions, the various stakeholders, and the timeframes for achieving those actions. So as in your capacity, Louis did speak about associations, women's organizations. Of course, it's easier we need scale and we need voice and we need the amplification of voices. So if you are able to, through your women's business associations, ensure that, that those concerns are reflected and you can become part of monitoring the implementation of those various actions that are laid out in the AfCFTA Action Plan, that is one way of sustained involvement in AfCFTA implementation at the national level. And while we are contributing to the discourse on the AfCFTA protocol that will be developed, and I'm sure, and Louis has spoken on that, and the consultations that will be rolled out by the AfCFTA Secretariat for the development of the protocol, there is also the opportunity to become involved in that. But through it's easier through your business association to get that representation. There's also the opportunity to get involved in the AfCFTA negotiations for phase 2. Our negotiators are going to be negotiating on investment, on competition policy, and on intellectual property. Now, and I think this is important for the wide, not just for Blessing, but also for leaders of Africa, because what would the gender dimension of those issues entail? So how can we influence the negotiations? How can we get a head start on what should be in the protocol through interrogating the gender dimension of these phase 2 issues? So I think, being involved in research and advocacy and evidence-informed solutions, it would be really valuable for us to get that kind of information and potential research studies to be developed on the gender dimension of investment, competition policy, and intellectual property.
It seems to know a lot about this conference, All Women Conference. And one of the emerging themes from our conversation today is the need to get women in the informal sector included through and through in the conversation. and to drive the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreements. So regarding this particular conference, what specific strategies are in place to get women in the informal sector to shape the design and the implementation of the conference? And how is this conference going to be different from the typical conference that is always academic in nature, where people come to speak in English language, and without meaning that women that are not educated may not be able to participate effectively in such a conference? So what is it that this particular conference is going to be doing differently to ensure that these significant components of the AfCFTA implementation is not left out of the conversation?
They will still speak English though. The difference is that you have to understand the pressure that the Secretary General is going through. He is new. After Secretary General, he's new. Secondly, his mandate didn't have to establish a protocol on women. And that is a difficult challenge. Now, for him to get it done, he has to propose it to the heads of state for them to adopt. That is where the issue is. So the heads of state are the heads of state of every woman in every member state. So, like Nadira was saying, it is time for women associations to gather themselves, put themselves together, come out with one frontline decision or suggestions or propositions, forward it to the agencies or institutions that can also forward it to the technical working groups of their states. They will then forward it during this conference, because I'm sure they will be invited. And it's going to be, the nature of it has not been disclosed yet, but what we know is that it's going to be a very big conference. It's going to be a bi-week-long conference, and I'm sure it's going to factor so many things. Everyone might not be there, but I can say if we go through the structure, we will be represented and our voice will be heard. That is one of the things I'm pushing for, especially in the area of intellectual property rights. Most countries don't have intellectual property rights. And so how would you get it? You have to speak to those involved. You have to speak to those who are in the industry. What is their opinion? What do they think? What do they want to see change? Put them together. Then we push it to the technical working groups of the states. Then they will now present it to their ministers of trade. Then they will further present it at the technical meetings, and then finally to the heads of state. This is the way to approach it. If it doesn't go through, there are select committees on women in every parliament. Every parliament should have a select committee on women issues. You have to approach, you can approach them and drop this your concern. Jerry, this is some of the ways we can. But the conference, they are yet to come out with how it's going to look like. But I know it's going to be like a week-long program that is going to look into taking voices and opinions and also factoring what the commission. But one thing I know the Secretary General want to do is to really support women in terms of SMEs.
And you want to respond to how we can actually make the conference, to reflect the voice and the participation, active and dominant participation of women in the informal sector?
I don't have too much to add to Louis. I think from our side, it's certainly more on ECA side, it's more support at the national level through the AfCFTA national strategies. But as Louis indicated, the political momentum, and I'm South African, and it was President Ramaphosa at last year's AU summit, Louis, you will recall, who introduced the idea of a women in trade protocol. So I think it's also everything is lined up. There is strong political will to this. There is an understanding of the critical role that women play in trade, the contribution to and the significant impact that they make to trade and how they are impacted by trade, and the fact that the time has come. So, I have no doubt that this AfCFTA protocol women in trade protocol will be developed with a particular emphasis on providing support to women SMEs. But in saying that, we also need to be able to talk about gender mainstreaming. And I think that it's fantastic that we're having an AfCFTA protocol, and we should absolutely have that. But, we need to be talking about mainstreaming gender throughout the AfCFTA agreement. So when we are talking about the goods and services, when we are talking about the dispute mechanism, trade and services, we have the Women in Trade protocol, but we need to be mainstreaming on a women's investment agenda for the AfCFTA. What will that entail? And women's business associations here play a key role in ensuring that investment opportunities for women across all sectors are on this agenda, and investment barriers are addressed. For the same goes for competition policy, and the same goes for intellectual policy. So it's incredibly important that we get this Women in Trade protocol, but in saying that, we also need to be talking and thinking about mainstreaming gender throughout the AfCFTA agreement so that it impacts on women in their various roles. Women in manufacturing, women as workers. And we also need to interrogate what are those policies, those that they don't favor women in manufacturing, and what will a holistic approach to industrial policy entail? So, and that may not be covered in a Women in Trade protocol. But then, what happens to women as workers who may be exploited and who may remain in lower skilled, lower paying jobs in manufacturing industries? We can't forget about them as African countries shift to higher productive sectors, and as the AfCFTA starts spurring industrialization, we have to ensure that women get the required skills and the technical training, the specialized on-the-job skills training that will allow them to move to higher value-added jobs in manufacturing. So yes, I'm incredibly excited about the Women in Trade protocol, but I also want to see gender being mainstreamed throughout the AfCFTA agreement, even if it's just in terms of our thinking as a start.
Thank you so much for that. Louis, back to you. And this question is building off what one of the participants would like to know. It focuses on the issue of involvement of the private sector in the implementation of AfCFTA and the significant constraints posed by transportation problems across different African countries. So would you like to speak to the strategies in place and what needs to be done to address these transportation barriers, and whether the private sector is involved or not involved in the implementation of AfCFTA? And if they are not involved, what are the reasons for their omission in the implementation of AfCFTA?
Thank you. In fact, private sector was my specialty under the consultative process. I was focused more on building the private sector and strategies. And I must be honest with you that my area was even pushing for a payment system. And I'm glad that we saw that. The private sector cannot be excluded. The private sector cannot be excluded from this at all. In fact, they are the first. The governments cannot run it without the private sector. And so the private sector, right from the area of finance, right to energy, wherever you find yourself, which is not even public-private participation at all. The pure private sector stream is the main engine of the African Continental Free Trade. In fact, the public-private participation comes on board when you're supposed to have certain protocols that cannot be taken or decisions that cannot be taken by sector alone, especially capitalized investments like building infrastructure. Examples are rail and transportation, maritime, and all those. Those ones you need the public policies. But at the end of the day, it should be public-private sector participation. A critical example, I was glad, if you take aviation sector, the Ethiopian Airlines is trying hard to have some kind of 60-40 agreement with some countries to take over their airlines. If you take rail, I know TAC is also doing something like that. TAC is also playing an active role in terms of expanding the rails in Africa. Afrexim Bank is coming to contact with a lot of private sector financiers to support a lot of initiatives that are happening. So, yes, one important thing is that you might not approach the secretariat directly, but you can approach your institution in your country and take interest in what you would like to support. Start by identifying the product, identify the market, and expand into the manufacturing industry towards industrialization. So the private sector cut across all these groups, chambers of commerce. Yeah, if you come together, the Chamber of Commerce is what has been licensed to issue certificate of origin. And the Chamber of Commerce forms a lot of the private sector members. So I think this is the way we can look at it. And I know there'll be more approaches too.
So thanks for that. Back to you, Nadira. And this is a question from Aisha. Aisha likes to know the current makeup of the AfCFTA secretariat, and particularly the number of women that are currently hired to work at the secretariat.
I think I'm going to call on Louis to come in on this. As far as I know, Louis, I don't have the statistics with me, and it's probably better, Aisha, that which is also my daughter's name, by the way. It's probably best for us to get back to you on this. I know that they have a very strong woman representation in very senior positions, including in the maybe not the chief of staff, but the head of legal and in up senior management. But I don't know the exact breakdown. But Louis, I know that it's strong representation, probably over 50%, or I don't know exactly what it is, but maybe I'll ask Louis and then we just get the exact numbers for you. Louis, can you just assist me?
Thank you, Nadira. I think that they are opening up a lot of structured appointments. They've advertised it, but currently I think that they have proposed that the first Deputy Secretary General will be a woman. But currently, those who are in office, we have the Director of Trading Services. She's a woman. Then I think we have Communications Head, that is also a woman. And currently, I think that, as you mentioned, the legal, but they are now structuring the rest. The rest are going to cut across. So they have about 300 proposed vacancies for not only the Secretariat, but the Secretariat operating regionally. Maybe you have East Africa, after Secretariat, after activities there, West Africa. So all these are going to come, but currently the ones I know the Director of Trading Services, Communications, and then in terms of the legal, and that they don't have much staffing now at the moment. Yeah.
Fatuma, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question to any of the panelists? Hello, Fatuma? I think she's not able to unmute herself right now. Yeah. So one last question to each of you. Nadira, what have you learned from the European experience implementing a similar trade agreement? And what does this mean for gender mainstreaming of the AfCFTA trade agreement?
You mean learning from the European experience, particularly with respect to gender?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I think firstly, learning from the European experience is that continental integration takes a long time. And I think as excited as we all are, I mean, look at the EU. It took many, many years for them to get to the stage at which they're at. So the AfCFTA is a long-term game. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next year, maybe in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years, but it will happen. And I think the fact that it was historic in terms of the agreement being signed and the number of ratifications that were received. The political will is there to implement this. But I think it's also in saying that we need to be cognizant of the fact that this is not it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It needs the support. And I think what has come out clearly through today's panel is the fact that we all need to be involved in some capacity or another. And these public outreach events, these stakeholder discussions, they are all critically important. So, of course, the EU is fantastic in terms of the stakeholder consultations they have, in terms of making these gender inclusive, which we on the continent don't have the benefit of. But when we talk about gender mainstreaming, one of the critical components of gender mainstreaming is gender inclusive consultations. So certainly in going to your question of what we can learn from the EU experience. So firstly, this is not going to happen overnight. But in saying that, we do have best practices, we do have lessons learned that we can learn from them on the gender dimension of continental integration in the context of the AfCFTA. And I think what we can do better is ensuring that our consultative process is inclusive. And by inclusive, I mean not just having women from the private sector and from formal business associations involved, but representation goes across the board. We get women from marginalized groups, we get women from grassroots organizations, we get activists, we get we didn't even talk about labor issues in the context of the AfCFTA. We didn't even talk about trade unions, but we didn't even the human rights dimension of the AfCFTA. And that's also something that we can learn from the EU, but not just the EU, because when we look at African human rights, just ourselves, when we look at the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, when we look at the Maputo Protocol, when we look at African jurisprudence on human rights, what can we scale up? How can we apply our own human rights instruments in the context of the AfCFTA? And I think this is something that we need to explore further. There are international human rights treaties that we are party to. There are our regional instruments that have human rights clauses in them. And this is something that we need to be able to come together as a collective and see how it can be built upon through the AfCFTA. So yes, the EU holds a lot of experience, holds great lessons, but there's also African jurisprudence in our own instruments that we need to be interrogating further, and we need to be holding our governments to account because they have signed up to these agreements, and on the regional level, on the global level, and this is something that we need to ensure is also reflected as part of inclusive AfCFTA implementation. And of course, accountability, transparency, and participation are key human rights principles that I would like to see reflected in the AfCFTA. But that's also African human rights. Thank you
so much, Nadira. And Louis, a minute. I want you to reflect on what the African Continental Free Trade Agreement can learn from the EU experience in just 1 minute.
Thank you. In just 1 minute, I think that we need to build on our macroeconomic indicators seriously as member states, because the EU, that is one strength that they have. We need to really look at industrialization and manufacturing seriously, because that is one of the good things about the EU. And again, we need to know that under the Continental Free Trade, it is not all countries that are equal to liberalize at the same time. The developed ones are liberalizing for 5 years, the others are 10. But for how long would they be able to do that? So we need to have a stronger macroeconomic positions so that we can all develop at the same pace. If we don't, it will be difficult for others to anchor the revenue for others. That is the difficulty why
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And I really want to thank Louis and Nadira for sharing their great insight about the African Continental Free Trade Area. Thank you, everyone, for driving the conversation through your various engagement on the chat box. And I also want to thank you, those of you that have joined us in the previous series as part of the Towards Greater Integration series. We hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks for our next section of the series, which is titled Who Benefits? A Look at the Consequences of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We'll share the invitation about the series when the official announcement is made. In the meantime, please do hit that subscribe button to subscribe to Leaders of Africa on YouTube channel. And please do join our new discourse community at Leaders of Africa/Connect to continue the conversation and for our future program alert. And please do follow Leaders of Africa on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, bye.